How far would you go to fulfill a promise to God? Have you ever made a vow in the midst of desperation? Have you said, "If you help me, I will do this for you"? Jephthah did, and the price was his own daughter. This isn't a symbolic tale or an exaggerated warning. It's a real, raw, and deeply human story. A man rejected by his family, raised up by God as a leader, and ultimately brought to sacrifice his only daughter because of a hasty vow. In this video, you'll uncover what led Jephthah to make that promise, what it means for us today, and how this story might transform the way you speak to God, especially if you're facing critical decisions, moments of extreme faith, or divine silences that test your soul. There was a time when Israel desperately needed a deliverer. And that deliverer wasn't a king or a prophet. It was Jephthah. A man with no family name, no prestige, no honor in his land. The son of a prostitute, cast out by his own brothers, disinherited and humiliated. They told him he didn't belong, that he was not one of them. And so, with a broken heart, he left. But he didn't remain there in sorrow. He found refuge in a land called Tob, and over time, became a feared warrior. He gathered around him outcasts and wanderers, men without purpose, and became their leader. From exile to commander. And then, in a twist of irony, the very ones who had rejected him came looking for him, to save them from war. The elders of Gilead were desperate. The Ammonites were advancing, and there was no one to defend them. So they pleaded with Jephthah. And with dignity, he replied, "You come to me now when you're in trouble? If I return and the Lord gives me victory, will you truly make me your leader?" They agreed. And Jephthah returned. But he returned transformed. No longer merely an outcast, he was now an instrument of God. Before stepping onto the battlefield, Jephthah made a vow. A reckless one. "If you give me victory, Lord, I will offer as a sacrifice whoever comes out first from my house to greet me." It was impulsive. Emotional. He didn't think it through. He just spoke, like so many of us do when we're under pressure. God granted him victory. The Ammonites were defeated. Israel rejoiced. And when Jephthah came home, his daughter, his only child, came out to meet him with tambourines and dancing. He broke, tore his clothes and cried out, "Oh, my daughter! You have crushed me, for I have made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot go back." She didn't protest. She didn't argue. She only asked for 2 months to mourn her fate in the mountains with her friends. And then, she returned. And Jephthah kept his word. It's not a happy ending. It's a wound that bleeds between the lines of Scripture. A story that unsettles, that questions, but also reveals. Because Jephthah was not a villain. He was a man of faith, but also a man shaped by deep wounds, by rejection, by a desperate need to be validated, even by God. And this is where the story becomes ours. Because many of us have also made promises out of fear, anxiety, or urgency. We've said things we should have never said. Offered things we should have never offered. God doesn't ask for desperate vows. He asks for trust. He doesn't want promises born in chaos, but faithfulness in the ordinary. That is the true victory. Jephthah wasn't born into wealth. Not even into a name that brought pride. He was born into stigma. In a culture where lineage meant everything, he was the son of a prostitute. And although his father was a man of status in Gilead, His half-brothers made it clear. "You will inherit nothing with us," they said. "You're the son of another woman." From a young age, Jephthah tasted the bitter flavor of rejection. Not for his mistakes, but for his origin, something he never chose. Yet he was judged for it. Has it ever happened to you? Being rejected for something beyond your control, your name, your appearance, your family story? Jephthah was pushed out of his home and his land, branded as unworthy. And so, with a wounded heart, he fled to Tob. Far from the noise, far from those who should have protected him. And while many would have expected his story to end in ruin, God had other plans. Because the place of rejection often becomes the place of training. There, in a foreign land, Jephthah became a warrior. Not one quick to fight, but one whose character had been hardened by pain. The Bible says that worthless men gathered around him. Men with no future, no direction. And Jephthah led them. Why did they follow him? Because he understood the wound of abandonment. He was one of them. In a world that had labeled them as lost, Jephthah became their guide. And without realizing it, he was being shaped for something far greater. The same happens in our lives. Sometimes we believe rejection is the end, but God uses it as part of the process. Have doors been closed to you? Have people turned their backs on you? Do you feel like you don't belong? Maybe you're in your own personal top, a place where no one applauds you, but where God is preparing you in silence. Many of today's leaders were once rejected. And that's no coincidence. Because those who've tasted loneliness know how to value true connection. Those who've experienced pain lead with empathy. And those who were once excluded, when raised up, they don't forget where they came from. Years later, when the elders of Gilead found themselves in danger from the Ammonites, who did they seek? Jephthah, the very one they had cast aside. That's how life works, it turns. The same people who pushed him away now needed him. And ironically, Jephthah could have refused. He could have said, "Not now." But he didn't. Because when God works on your heart, He prepares you not only to fight, but to forgive. That also teaches us something vital. True greatness isn't in seeking revenge, but in answering with purpose. And Jephthah understood that well. Before accepting, he set conditions, not out of pride, but out of dignity. If he was going to lead, he had to be recognized. If he was going to risk his life, he wouldn't do it as a pawn, but as a leader. And this brings us to another powerful lesson. There are moments when you must know your worth. When you've been forged in the fire, you can't settle for less than what God has placed in you. And if that means setting healthy boundaries, that's okay. Because even grace needs structure. What the world rejected, God chose. What the family despised, heaven prepared. Jephthah had no title, no clean reputation. But he had something many lacked: character, courage, and a faith that, though imperfect, made him part of sacred history. This is where Jephthah's rise begins. From the dust of rejection to the platform of purpose. Because when God says yes, it doesn't matter how many people said no. Israel was on the brink of collapse. The Ammonites, a powerful and hostile nation, were preparing to attack. The cities were tense, the leaders confused, the people afraid. Once again, they had sinned, and now they were reaping the consequences. In the time of the judges, the cycle was always the same: disobedience, oppression, crying out, and deliverance. And this time, they desperately needed a savior. But no one was available. No heroes in sight. No names echoed with authority. Until someone mentioned Jephthah. Imagine it, the man who was despised, humiliated, and exiled, suddenly becomes their only hope. The elders of Gilead, the very ones who had slammed the door in his face, now came seeking him, heads low, eyes desperate. They had no other option. And he was the only way out. When they arrived in Tob, Jephthah listened. But he didn't rush in. He was no longer that young man desperate for approval. He had learned not to give away his value so easily. His response was clear, without bitterness, but with conviction. Didn't you hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why do you come to me now, when you're in distress? That question still echoes today. How many times are we dismissed by people, employers, even family, only to be sought out when a crisis hits? And how often, like Jephthah, do we find ourselves at a crossroads? Do we help, or let them learn the hard way? But Jephthah didn't respond from ego. He responded from purpose. He set conditions. If I return and the Lord gives me victory, I will be your leader. Not out of ambition, but because he understood, you cannot lead without authority, without respect, without true recognition. They agreed. And they sealed a covenant before God at Mizpah. It wasn't just a political agreement, it was a spiritual act. Jephthah knew that what lay ahead wasn't just a battle. It was a war with deep spiritual roots. And he understood that if God wasn't with him, all would be lost. There's something powerful in that moment. Jephthah, with no temple, no priestly lineage, no official title, behaved like a true man of faith. Before fighting, he sought direction. Before raising the sword, he lifted his voice to God. That order changes everything. And here's where it becomes practical for us. How often do we face crises, in family, in finances, in health, and our first instinct is to chase after human solutions? Jephthah wasn't perfect. But he understood one truth clearly. Victory doesn't come from strategy. It comes from divine direction. This applies to every area of life. You may be trying to start a business, restore a relationship, move to another country, but if you don't first seek direction from heaven, the risk of making a mistake is high. The world today lives in constant crisis, and many make decisions under pressure and urgency. Jephthah reminds us that when chaos strikes, divine direction must come first. There's also something deeply human about the elders of Gilead. When everything was fine, they forgot about Jephthah. But when fear arrived, they remembered the one they had rejected. Sometimes pain is the only path that teaches us to value what we once despised. And yes, life turns. Those who look down on you today may one day come seeking your advice, your talent, or your compassion. But the key is how you choose to respond. Jephthah didn't negotiate from a place of hurt, he negotiated from conviction. That's what separates a reactive leader from one guided by heaven. God wasn't just restoring Jephthah. He was using the crisis to position him. Because there are moments when the scene changes not because of human merit, but because heaven declares, "It's your time." And when that happens, no rejection can stop your purpose. Jephthah was ready to face the battle. He had been humiliated, he had been restored, and now he stood in the position to deliver his people. But at the threshold of war, before he raised his sword, he lifted his voice, not to the enemy, but to God. And there, in that defining moment, he made a vow. If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, whoever comes out of the door of my house to greet me when I return victorious will be yours, Lord, and I will offer them as a burnt offering. At first glance, it might seem like an expression of faith, a display of total devotion. But in truth, it was an act of desperation. God didn't ask for it. There was no divine instruction prompting it. It was a vow born from emotion, not from direction. And here lies a profound lesson. Not everything that looks like faith is wisdom. Many people make radical promises, hoping to secure God's favor, as if he needs a bargain to fulfill his will. But God doesn't operate through trades or emotional blackmail. He moves by grace, not manipulation. Jephthah, perhaps unknowingly, was projecting his insecurity onto the altar. Maybe he thought, I'm not like the other judges. I don't come from a noble family. I don't have everyone's approval. So if I really want to make sure God gives me the victory, I need to offer something big. And what was meant to be big became tragic. This still happens today. Some promise to fast until they get a response. Others offer all their money, their time, their plans, even their families, just to get a sign. But faith is not about negotiation. It's about trust. God had already chosen Jephthah. He had already called him. He had already positioned him. There was no need for an additional sacrifice. But the human heart, when gripped by insecurity, sometimes tries to earn what was already given by grace. Like the father who promises God he'll quit smoking if his child is healed. Or the woman who says, if I get this job, I'll never sin again. Or the student who cries, if you help me pass this exam, I'll serve you for life. All of these vows are born from emotion, not divine direction. And the problem isn't just that they're unnecessary. It's that, when fulfilled, they often leave scars. Some people sacrifice relationships, health, mental stability, even their integrity, just to keep a promise they never should have made. Jephthah could have asked God. He could have waited. He could have simply said, Lord, I'm in your hands. Do as you will. But he chose a different path. And though he was sincere, he wasn't wise. And that teaches us something essential. Sincerity without discernment can be destructive. Not everything we do with good intentions produces good fruit. Sometimes what begins as an act of devotion becomes a wound we carry for years. That's why it's so important to measure our words, especially when we speak to God. Faith doesn't need embellishment. It doesn't require theatrical promises. All it needs is a heart that says, I trust you, even when I don't understand. That simple prayer is worth more than 1,000 empty vows. And so, with that vow hanging in the air like a silent shadow, Jephthah went to war. He won. He triumphed. He was celebrated. But without knowing, tragedy was already waiting at his doorstep. The battle ended sooner than expected. God's favor was with Jephthah. The Ammonite army was crushed without mercy. Israel rejoiced. The people believed again. Those who once doubted now applauded. The man who had once been cast out as unworthy was now the national hero. But Jephthah didn't return from the battlefield like everyone else. He wasn't thinking of crowns or praise. His mind echoed with the memory of his vow. That reckless promise he made before the war. That line he may have believed would never need to be fulfilled. Whatever comes out of my house first, will be yours, Lord." And then, it happened. As he approached home, he heard music, laughter, tambourines, dancing. And among the crowd that came running to welcome him, he saw his daughter, his only daughter, the girl he had raised alone, his everything, the one waiting with innocent joy for his return. And in that instant, Jephthah's heart shattered. There are no words to describe the pain of a father who sees his greatest joy become the fulfillment of his worst mistake. He tore his clothes. He cried out in anguish, "Oh, my daughter, you have broken me. You are the cause of my ruin, because I have made a vow to the Lord and I cannot take it back." She looked at him, not with anger, not with blame, but with a calm only heaven can explain. And she said, "Father, if you made a vow to the Lord, keep your word. Just allow me 2 months to go into the mountains with my friends and mourn my virginity." She was young. She had never married, never known human love. And yet, she accepted her fate. That kind of obedience is confronting. What kind of faith did that girl possess, that she wouldn't rebel? What kind of reverence did she have for her father and for God? Some scholars believe she was offered as a literal burnt sacrifice. Others argue she was dedicated to the Lord for life, remaining a virgin, never allowed to marry. Whatever the interpretation, one thing is clear: the tragedy was real. Jephthah lost his daughter. He lost his lineage. He lost his joy. And all because of an unnecessary vow. Do you see it? He won the war, but lost at home. He defeated the Ammonites, but was undone by his own words. And that contrast is brutal. Because many today live something similar. They succeed at work, but their family falls apart. They shine in public, but are broken in private. They achieve their goals, but at a cost they cannot afford. This is also a warning for modern times. Not everything that shines as victory is truly blessing. If you had to compromise your values, your relationships, or your peace to get it, did you really win? Sometimes, the enemy isn't out there. It's inside. In our insecurities. In our impulsive decisions. In the promises we make from fear. And the greatest battlefield can be our home. That's why this story shouldn't be read as just another biblical curiosity. It should be a living warning. How far are we willing to go to fulfill a promise we never should have made? Are we aware of what we're sacrificing when we speak without thinking? Jephthah's victory was real, but so was its cost. And that brings us to a painful but necessary truth. Sometimes the question isn't, did you win? But what did you lose to win? After the victory, the sound of drums faded. The celebrations ended. And Jephthah came face to face with the most terrifying silence of all. The silence of an empty home. The echo of his daughter's steps, the laughter that would never return, the empty seat at the table, all became unbearable. Sometimes, the real punishment isn't the loss itself. It's living with the knowledge that you caused it. There's no doubt Jephthah loved his daughter. He didn't offer her because she didn't matter. He offered her because he felt he had no other choice. Because he believed that faithfulness to God meant paying the full price. Even if that price broke him. But here lies the heart of the dilemma. Is it true faithfulness to do something God never asked for? The Bible doesn't say God demanded that vow. nor does it praise it. It simply leaves it there, raw, real, as if inviting us to meditate. What kind of faith drives a man to give up what he treasures most? Because of a poorly spoken promise? The daughter, on her part, is a character that deeply moves us. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't blame. She asked her father for 2 months. 2 months to mourn her virginity in the mountains with her friends. She didn't weep for her death. She wept for her destiny. To never marry. To never bear children. To never leave a legacy. She was young. She had dreams, plans, possibilities. But she accepted. Why? Because in her heart, there was something many have lost today: reverence. A deep understanding that her life, in some mysterious way, was tied to a greater purpose, even if she couldn't understand it. And what did Jephthah do during those 2 months? The Bible doesn't say. But it's easy to imagine. Waiting in silence. Weeping alone. Burdened with guilt. Each day a reminder of his mistake. And when she returned, he fulfilled his vow. No father should ever have to live that. But Jephthah did. Not because he lacked faith, but because he had too much emotion. And this speaks to us, who so often confuse passion with wisdom. We think the more dramatic our sacrifice, the more it will move heaven. But faithfulness is not a chain. It's a relationship. God does not want us to fulfill vows that destroy what He Himself values. Life, love, family, compassion. Today, many are keeping promises God never asked for. Vows that are pulling them away from their children, their spouses, even from themselves. People carrying heavy guilt because they believe they failed their covenant with God, when in reality, that covenant was never heaven approved. Jephthah kept his vow, but he lost a part of himself. And his daughter became a symbol. From that time on, Scripture says, the daughters of Israel would go up to the mountains each year to mourn for her. Not to glorify the vow, but to remember her. To make sure she was not forgotten. To remind the world that not every sacrifice is holy. And so, through ashes and tears, a bitter chapter came to a close. A chapter that speaks to us with no sugarcoating. Misunderstood obedience can become tragedy. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and believers have asked the same question. Did Jephthah really sacrifice his daughter on an altar, or did he dedicate her to a life of perpetual virginity? As it often does in the most intense stories, the Bible remains silent. The text in Judges 11 simply says that after the time of mourning, he fulfilled the vow he had made. And it adds, she never knew a man. This has led to two very different interpretations, both with valid arguments. On one hand, some believe the sacrifice was literal. That Jephthah, out of loyalty to his word and a misunderstood sense of duty to God, offered his daughter as a burnt offering. It's a brutal view, yes. But it echoes the ancient belief that vows were sacred, binding, and unbreakable. That Jephthah, deeply influenced by the culture of his time, felt compelled to carry it out to the bitter end. But that view raises a difficult spiritual dilemma. Would God accept a human sacrifice? Would He condone someone dying for a promise never required? And here enters the second interpretation. That Jephthah consecrated his daughter to the Lord, but did not kill her. That the burnt offering was symbolic. A total dedication of her life to temple service. Like what would happen later with Samuel. The phrase "she never knew a man" reinforces this idea, suggesting that her sacrifice was not her life, but her future, her marriage, her motherhood. So then, what is the truth? The Bible keeps it veiled. And maybe it does so to push us to look beyond the event and grasp the principle. Because whether literal or symbolic, the tragedy is real. Jephthah lost his daughter. She lost her future. And what should have been a moment of national glory became a time of private mourning. And whether her fate was death or lifelong consecration, this remains the lesson. A promise made without wisdom can cost you more than you ever imagined. And today, that still happens. Fathers who lose connection with their children because they're too busy serving God. Marriages that fall apart under the weight of poorly managed religious burdens. People who live in shame for not fulfilling vows God never asked for in the first place. This dilemma also compels us to reflect on our image of God. Is He a harsh judge who demands blind sacrifice? Or a father who desires that we follow Him with understanding, not fear? Centuries later, Jesus Himself said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And that should change our perspective. Because today, many still believe that to please God, they must pay extreme prices. That if they're not suffering, they're not being spiritual. That unless they give something great, God won't listen to them. Yet the message of the gospel is different. The greatest sacrifice has already been made on the cross. And what God desires from us is not pain, but sincere surrender, daily obedience, and a willing heart. Jephthah's story, for all its heaviness, invites us to think before we speak, to seek counsel before we act, to discern before we make a vow. Because although heaven understands our mistakes, the earth often bears their consequences. So the next time you feel the urge to make a promise, remember this. God doesn't need grand vows. He desires consistent faithfulness. And sometimes, the wisest choice is to be silent, pray, and wait. Jephthah's story is not just an ancient tragedy. It's a mirror, a call to examine the heart. Because even if we never make a vow as extreme as his, all of us, at some point, have made promises, often without weighing the weight of our words. Some promise to change. Others vow to quit a habit. Some pledge to serve God if He performs a miracle, or swear they'll never fail again if given a second chance. And they do it sincerely. But sincerity alone isn't always enough if it's not joined by wisdom. Promises can build or destroy. A promise made with discernment can shape your character, strengthen your faith, and deepen your relationships. But a promise made under pressure, driven by fear or emotion, can become a burden too heavy to bear. Jephthah wasn't the only one. How many leaders today are trapped by commitments they cannot fulfill? How many parents have made promises to their children they never kept? How many people have entered into relationships, jobs, or even ministries based on vows they made without thinking? And perhaps most serious of all, how many times have we invoked God's name to seal promises He never asked us to make? God takes no pleasure in forced sacrifices. He doesn't need theatrical displays to believe in your faith. He already knows you. He already knows what you can give. And often, what He desires most is not some grand declaration, but simple obedience. Want to be faithful to God? Start with the basics. Be honest in your words. Don't promise what you can't keep. And if you do make a promise, fulfill it humbly, not pridefully. This applies to everyday life too. For example, if you promise to take care of your health, honor that. You don't need to vow to go to the gym 7 days a week or follow the most extreme diet. Start by walking 20 minutes a day. Cut sugar little by little. That too is faithfulness. If you promise to love someone, do it with action. You don't have to give them the moon or write poems every day. Just be present. Listen. Respect. A promise is not measured by its size, but by its truth. And if you've failed in past promises, don't condemn yourself. Jephthah couldn't go back. But you can. The gospel is an open door for those who need to begin again. You can come to God, ask for wisdom, and realign your path. Maybe you made a vow without thinking. Maybe you've carried unnecessary guilt for years. Today, you can let it go. You can say, Lord, I don't want to live by empty promises. I want to live in your will, step by step, without shortcuts or exaggerations. Because true promises don't need noise. They're built in the quiet of consistency, in the secrecy of an obedient heart, in the day-to-day walk of someone who chooses to follow God without conditions. And that is also faith. Faith that doesn't seek shortcuts. Faith that doesn't need promises to be heard. Faith that simply says, Here I am. Let your will be done. Every decision leaves an echo. And the echo of Jephthah's vow didn't end with his daughter's tears. It didn't fade after military victory. On the contrary, it echoed for generations. Each year, the young women of Israel would go up into the hills to mourn for her. Not to worship her. Not to justify what happened. But so she would not be forgotten. That alone speaks volumes. There are decisions that become collective memory. The people of Israel didn't throw a feast. They held a mourning ritual. A time of grief, of warning, of reverence for a life marked by obedience, but also by a father's carelessness. And so, unintentionally, Jephthah left behind a double legacy. That of a man of faith, and of a man who shows us what happens when faith isn't guided by wisdom. Despite his error, Jephthah is mentioned in Hebrews 11, the chapter known as the Hall of Faith, alongside names like Abraham, Moses, and David. Why? How can someone with such a painful story be remembered as a hero of the faith? Because the Bible doesn't glorify the perfect. It glorifies those who believe, even in their fragility. Jephthah believed. He rose from rejection. He led in obedience. He didn't turn back. And though he made mistakes, his faith was real. That gives us hope. Because many think that if they've failed in the past, there's nothing left. But God doesn't cancel his calling because of our errors. He corrects us. He shapes us. And he keeps using us. Yes, sometimes with scars. But scars that speak of redemption. Jephthah's legacy also lives on in every person today who dares to break toxic cycles. In every parent who chooses to raise their children with awareness. In every leader who learns to seek God before making a move. In every believer who understands that a relationship with God is not theater. It's a living connection. And more than that, his legacy lives in every person who has ever been rejected and still rises. Because if Jephthah taught us anything, it's this. You don't need a clean name to be used by God. You just need a willing heart. But his story also invites us to ask, what legacy are we building? Every choice matters. The way you speak to your children, what you promise at work, the decisions you make when no one is watching, all of it adds up, for better or worse. So the question is, will what you're planting today be worth remembering tomorrow? You don't need fame to leave a legacy. Just plant truth. Live with integrity. Love without conditions. Because even if the world isn't watching, someone is. Your children. Your spouse. Your disciples. Your friends. And they're learning more from your actions than your words. Jephthah never imagined his vow would be remembered for millennia. And you don't know which detail of your life will be what others remember. So live each day with intention. Not to be perfect, but to be faithful. Because in the end, more than the mistake itself, what leaves a mark is how we respond to it. And if Jephthah, with everything he lived, was remembered for his faith, that means you and I can also write a story worth telling. Jephthah's story doesn't have the happy ending we often crave. It doesn't close with hugs or miracles that fix everything. It ends in silence, in sorrow, in mourning, but also in lessons that transcend time. Between faith and failure, Jephthah walked a fragile line. And he did so like many of us. With good intentions. With a believing heart. But also with unhealed wounds. With a need for validation. And with a limited understanding of what God truly desired from him. Which leads us to an honest question. Where are you and I? Are we making promises to God from a healthy place? Or from the pressure of the moment? Are we walking in mature faith? Or in impulsive spirituality, full of emotional vows we barely understand? Maybe you too have made rushed promises. Maybe you swore you'd change, serve, surrender everything, if God did that one thing you so desperately needed. And maybe now you live carrying a debt you don't even know how to repay. Let me tell you something, with all the weight of this story, God doesn't want you enslaved to a vow. He wants you free in His grace. He is a father. And a loving father does not delight in seeing his children fulfill painful pacts he never asked for. He wants your sincerity, not your sacrifice. He wants your heart, not your performance. He wants you to walk with Him, not try to impress Him. Jephthah's story is intense, yes. But it's also deeply human. It reminds us that real faith is not perfect. That we can love God and still fail. That we still have a place in His story, even if we've made irreparable mistakes. What matters is not pretending we haven't fallen. What matters is learning, rising, and not repeating the same patterns. Today, you have an opportunity. Not to make more promises, but to start again. To say to God, I want to walk with you without conditions. I want to obey, not from fear, but from love. Jephthah lived between extremes. He was rejected and then exalted. He was brave, but also broken. His life shows us that leadership without inner healing can be dangerous. And that faith, true faith, must be guided by wisdom. Maybe you're in your own battle today. Maybe real enemies are knocking at your door. Anxiety, debt, illness, loneliness. You don't need to make a vow for God to fight for you. You just need to come close. With humility. With trust. With truth. And if you've lost things along the way, if you felt like your vow cost you more than you could bear, then bring it to Him. There is no wound God cannot redeem. There is no story He cannot rewrite with grace. So today, more than closing a story, I invite you to open a conversation with God. Stop negotiating. Start walking as a beloved son, as a restored daughter. Because between faith and failure, there is still a path. And that path is called grace. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on your decisions, your promises, and your walk with God, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to know that God's grace is stronger than our mistakes. Like this video if you value powerful biblical content. Subscribe to the channel to keep receiving stories that don't just inform, but transform. And if you haven't seen our previous video, the story of Enoch, the man who never tasted death, I've left it right here at the end. It's the complete opposite of Jephthah's journey, yet just as powerful. Because while Jephthah shows how one reckless vow can change a destiny, Enoch reveals how a life of intimacy with God can lead straight into eternity.